All right, now we're going to discuss postural considerations, and this is important because many of our clients are going to have postural issues. Okay, and before we can progress with them and do a lot of kind of that functional training, we need to make sure that they have that kind of stable posture. Okay, so you can look at the picture on the right and you can automatically see poor posture versus good posture, and there's multiple different types of poor posture, and we'll discuss those here in a bit. Okay. The way that the body is held or positions has a lot to do with how it moves. So if someone's posture looks like this person on the left and they have kyphosis and their hips are back and their flat is back, okay, and their kind of knees are overly bent, when they have that kind of posture, that's going to affect everything that they do, from their daily habits to their movements with you as a trainer. The starting position influences the movement that is to follow. So you can imagine if someone looks like this individual on the left with that forward head tilt and the kyphosis, their squat is going to be impacted by that initial movement, okay? If beginning in a suboptimal position, the brain tries to make up by altering body mechanics in an attempt to correct the posture or movement. So essentially what that says is that just because an individual has poor posture doesn't mean that they won't be able to do a movement. But what it does mean is that that movement is going to be altered, and that's going to include using musculature in a way that it shouldn't and potentially increasing their chance of injury. So there are a lot of posture cues that are important for us to use with our clients. I've listed a few here below. Right now, before I list them, I want you to kind of think through, if you have been talking to your client about posture, what are some cues that you would give, right? So just pause right now, think through those cues for posture, and when you've thought through a few, press play, and let's look through some of these. Standing up straight. Who has said that to their clients? I want you to stand up nice and straight, or sit up nice and straight, depending on what posture you have them in. Tuck in the chin. So what happens for a lot of people is that they start to lift their head up here, okay? Or vice versa, they go down too low. Okay, so tucking in the chin, just make sure that their head is kind of faced forward neutrally in a neutral spine. Hold the shoulders back. That's another one. Or pull the shoulders back. So a lot of times, because we sit, right, we tend to have this natural kyphosis that happens over the day, okay? So it's really important to have them bring their shoulders up, back, and down, okay? So holding those shoulders back. You might hear sometimes people say, I want you to squeeze those shoulder blades together like there's a pencil between them, and giving them some visuals to think through. And then drawing in those abdominals. And so drawing in those abdominals for many people might be a little bit tricky to think about. So oftentimes what I say, and you're going to hear this later in this lecture, is I want you to take your belly button, I want you to bring it as close to your spine as possible. And that's going to really help draw in your abdominals. So the top 3 weaknesses that we tend to see in our functional training is weaknesses in our lumbar stabilizers. So that includes muscles like our transverse abdominals and your internal obliques. So essentially think about your lumbar area and your core. Your hip stabilizers, so those include muscles like your glute med, your adductors, your quadris lumborum, your hip external rotators. Very common for people to be weak in those hip stabilizers. And then the top third, or the other third of the weaknesses that we usually find in our issues with functional training is our scapular stabilizers. Okay, so again, that upper back, low traps, and rhomboids. And if you think about why we're starting to see these weaknesses, you can understand that a lot of how we live our lives in a seated position is going to affect these things. Okay, if we sit most of the day, it's going to affect our lumbar stabilizers because we don't really need to stabilize ourselves if we can hunch forward. Okay, it's going to affect our hips because we're not having to engage them if we're sitting on them, literally. And then same thing with that scapular stabilizers, right? If we're sitting and we're allowed to hunch forward, in addition to not needing that lumbar area, we also won't need that kind of upper scapular area as well. So let's go into each of these a little bit more detail. So thinking about the lumbar stabilizers, or like, again, what we call the core, okay, there's multiple muscles that we're looking into. We're looking at that back, right? So erectus spinae, multifidus, the external and internal obliques, our transverse abdominals, our rectus abdominals, right? Those six-pack muscles. So we're thinking about a lot of musculature that's in that area. It is really responsible for strengthening and stabilizing our trunk. So the core, and we all know this, is incredibly important for functional training because we need it to be able to connect that upper body and lower body in any kind of movement pattern. Okay. We also integrate the hips and trunks and shoulders into movements with the core. And some functional training, anatomy, so things like just to go over what includes the core. We talked about those erectors that are the rectus spinae. Okay, we talked about some of those deep spine muscles. We know the abdominals, the rectus abdominals, right? What we often don't talk about is the pelvic floor. And this is something that is being more and more discussed as part of being in the fitness industry, because what we're realizing is that a lot of our clients, especially our female clients, but it still can affect males, need to focus in on pelvic floor muscles. This is something that affects a lot of women who have had children, and it affects women who are older who haven't had children. We're actually starting to see more and more cases of pelvic floor issues in younger women populations as well. So when we think about the pelvic floor, what you're essentially thinking about is the musculature that kind of sits right on top of the pelvis, okay? And that's in charge of being able to help with our urinary continence. It helps us be able to stabilize that core and really make sure that we're not straining any other muscles. But this is, again, an example of a muscle that's gotten weak because of our daily habits. When we sit down, we no longer have to draw in that real low area, that pelvic floor, to make sure that we don't fall forward. Okay, so if we're sitting all day, we don't need to engage the pelvic floor, and that's going to impact a lot of what we do in our daily lives. So that mostly notably impacts our urinary incontinence, our urinary continence. So essentially what that says is if we have a weak pelvic floor, we're not going to be able to stop the flow of urine when we're peeing. And that used to be something that we only thought about with older adults, but again, it's becoming more and more common with younger populations because of our daily habits. So you're going to see a lot of kind of continuing education credits and classes that you can take when you go to IDEA on really learning how to strengthen the pelvic floor, because it's not just do a bunch of crunches, right? It is a deep muscle, so it involves some very strategic movement patterns, and I'm going to show you a few of those in just a moment. So roles of the core include posture and balance and making sure we can transfer energy from lower to upper body, protecting our organs, obviously, right? And then anchoring movement patterns. So the concept of drawing in, and again, this is really going to help with that kind of pelvic floor muscles too, is really important. So what researchers found in the late 90s was that our transverse abdominals, right, which is that kind of really deep muscle right on top of the organs, and the multifidus muscle, they are both keys to making sure we unlock low back pain. And you can understand why. So if you look at this picture on the right, you can see that both muscles kind of surround that spine. So if we can really strengthen those muscles, we're going to be able to limit the amount of pain that we're experiencing in the low back. Okay, and these same researchers found that the transverse abdominals is the very first movement that's recruited when we utilize any kind of extremity. Okay, so that's why if you've heard a lot about the transverse abdominals and why it's so important to train the transverse abdominals, that's why it's usually the first muscle recruited when we move. Okay, these muscles along with the internal obliques serve as a natural weight belt. So if you think about power lifters, right, now they have those weight belts that they put around their waist, right, and it's really to help kind of hold everything in, and so they can kind of press against that as they lift heavy weight. Well, that's exactly what the transverse abdominals and multifidus does, right? That and those internal obliques act as that natural waist belt so that when you go through a movement pattern, that is contracting so that you can protect that spine and low back. So here's some cues for drawing in. I kind of talked about this one earlier. Take that belly button and draw it towards the spine, right? So what I often tell people is just, you know, imagine you have your shirt off and someone walks by, and what do? You suck in your gut, right? Okay, that's number 4 on this list. But it's the same idea. You could tell them that you're slipping on tight pants. So when you slip on tight pants, what do you have to do? You kind of have to draw in a little bit. Or, you know, if you're putting on a seatbelt and you put that seatbelt on, you have to draw in a little bit to make it fit. So whatever your cues are, making sure that your clients really understand what drawing in means is really important. Otherwise, you're saying that and they're not necessarily doing it. Okay. Again, here are some examples of poor posture and why drawing in can help. These are pretty exaggerated, but it is to help you. So on the far right, you can see that that's good posture, excuse me. Right next to that, you have a forward head tilt, and you're going to look at this in some of our labs here coming up. Sometimes that forward head tilt, you see kind of your typical kyphosis, which is that rounding of the upper back, lordosis, which is kind of that overaccentuated anterior pelvic tilt. and then your sway back, which is kind of the opposite. You're kind of tilting backwards. So if we think about causes of low back pain, a lot of it has to do with our posture, okay? And so it's important to understand the effect of how your pelvis tilts on that lumbar part of your spine, okay? We also know that pelvic tilt is the leading cause of low back pain. So what's ironic right now is that we kind of have this trend for having that exaggerated anterior pelvic tilt, right? So if you think about people on Instagram, right, bodybuilders, when they're posing, what they're essentially trying to do is exaggerate that anterior pelvic tilt so they look like they have more curvature in the spine. But that's a problem because we know that that's one of the major causes of low back pain, okay? So what you see on the right is kind of your neutral pelvis, right, neutral back. What you see on the left is that lordosis. Again, the pelvis tilts forward, and what that does is it pulls the lumbar spine into lordosis. And this is kind of that flat back syndrome, so it's exact opposite. So now this is an example of where you have the pelvic tilt posteriorly, so it rotates backwards, okay, and it pulls the lumbar spine flat. So what you're trying to avoid are both pictures on the left, and what you would like is that neutral pelvis, which a little bit of a sway, so it's not completely flat, but it's not overly anterior tilt. So here are some progressions for drawing in. Okay, so if you were trying to help a client with their posture, okay, and again, this is good for helping with that kind of building that abdominal muscles, okay, and the pelvic floor muscles. Start with a supine, being on your back with an object on your belly. So if you lay on your back and you put an object on that lower belly, right, what you're going to have your client do is try to draw that in so they can see the object go down. So that's a first starting spot. Then go into a prone position. Okay, so now you're kind of laying on the floor and you have the object between your belly and your floor. And what you want them to do is draw their belly button in, so if they can get a space between their belly button and the floor, that's perfect. They can understand it, and it's that kinesthetic learning. Step 3 in this is quadruped. So you're going to be on all fours and you're going to basically be kind of in that tabletop position, and you're going to pull your internal organs against gravity. So if you're in a tabletop position, your organs are going to want to push down, you're going to be pulling up. Then number 4 is kneeling, so on your knees, and you have kind of this rope or TheraBand or something around your waist. And once you draw in, you can see a space in that between the rope and your waist. And then standing, same thing, you're standing, you have a rope around your waist. When you draw in, you can start to see the space exists between the rope and your waist. That's a nice progression. So if you are working with a client who posture is an issue or they're trying to work on some of those pelvic floor muscles, these are some good ways to go about doing that. So here's some other movement patterns, and these are a little bit more advanced, but again, these are good to use. Okay, so first is supine lower body dead bug. We all probably know what dead bug is. Essentially, you're laying on your back, okay, and you kind of have opposite arm, opposite legs, trying to kind of meet in the center and go back down while maintaining a neutral pelvis. Prone opposite arm, opposite leg lifts. So you could do this on a fit ball. You can kind of do this laying down, whatever you want the progression to be. But again, you're lifting the arm and legs opposite of one another. Quadrupes opposite leg lifts. Okay, so this is kind of like bird dog, if you've ever seen this. Kneeling physio ball rollouts. You can see this is a very challenging exercise for most people. You can also do this on a TRX. That's a nice option, but very much engages those transverse abdominals and those deep pelvic floor muscles. And then I really like this movement because it's not just core, right? It's functional training. So now we're utilizing a little bit more muscles. Standing diagonal med ball weight plate raise, right? This basically looks like a wood chop, but by doing this movement, you are going to be involving the postural muscles. Here are some training favorites for the torso. So a prone inside plank, back extensions, physio ball, opposite arm, opposite leg. We kind of showed you that one earlier. Some physio ball knee tucks or pikes. Adding rotation is really important. So some sort of standing rotation. You could do Russian twists, wood chops, plank with opposite knee to opposite elbow. So if you need me to show you any of these, I'm happy to during lab. Some rotational progressions with a med ball, so you can do partner work, partner rotations, twists, and maybe even tosses, right? So tossing the ball, a wall side throw, chops. So hopefully these are all things and movement patterns that you understand, but they're not only functional in nature, but they're also really, really good for posture. So now let's focus on functional anatomy of the hip. So you have your hip flexors, your iliopsoas, your hip external rotators like your piriformis, your glute max, your abductors, and your hip adductors. So all of those are going to make up the kind of the main anatomy of the hip. Okay, here are some exercises in the lower body that can help build up those. Body weight squats, weighted front squats. So weighted front squats mean your hands are here, right, rather than kind of your traditional squat. Dumbbell or barbell deadlifts. Deadlifts are really great for lower body. And then TheraBand shuffle and monster walks. I think you guys do those a lot in 368. But any kind of movement like a monster walk is going to help. Always nice that once your client gets the basic movement patterns, they move on to single leg. So it could be lunges that are single leg but multi-directional. So that's great. That's very functional training focused. It could be a single leg bench squat. We only want to move on to this once they've been able to do a two-legged squat just fine. A single leg deadlift, same thing, only go to single leg once they can demonstrate that they can do a regular deadlift, and then a single leg bridge. Essentially what you want to make sure is that they earn their progression. So before you do a single leg any movement, make sure they earn that progression by demonstrating that original movement with both legs properly. And let's get into the functional anatomy of the shoulder. This includes your latissimus dorsi, your scapular stabilizers. Those include rhomboids and traps, your serratus anterior. Okay, there's a lot of other muscles, but those are the major muscles of the shoulder. And when we think about moving and trying to work those muscles, there's various exercises that you can do. So dumbbell YTWs, essentially all you're doing, right, is making the letter with your arms, okay, and you're holding dumbbells in your hand. Okay, so Y, T's, and W's, there's lots of videos on YouTube if you don't understand those. Barbell inverted rows are a great exercise to do. Single arm or leg dumbbell rows, stability ball arm, alternating chest press. That's something that we don't do a lot with our clients. When we think about chest, we do kind of double limb movements, whether it's bench or push-ups or even flies. But thinking about alternating the arms so that we're really trying to stabilize those muscles is really important. Because the second you go here, what has to stabilize, right? So if you're doing an alternating chest press, automatically that left side of your shoulder is going to have to stabilize, okay, as is your right, but left, to make sure that we don't kind of overcompensate and ruin our posture. And then single leg dumbbell curl press. So again, just a lot of examples of how you can work those shoulder joint muscles. So let's go ahead and summarize all that. Practicing good posture is imperative to making sure that you are training your client correctly. So if you look at them when they walk in, the very first thing that you should be doing is assessing their posture. You can do this in a formalized process, and you'll learn that in another lab, but you can also do this just by looking at them walk, okay? First thing we need to make sure that they do is draw in and engage those transverse abdominals so that they can stabilize the spine. We want to always incorporate multiple joints and multiple planes of motion. Okay, we want to emphasize closed kinetic chain over open kinetic chain. That way we can help with mobility and stability and strength and power. Okay, we always want to integrate core strength and stability into our programming, and making sure that we progress from from double leg exercise or double arm exercises to single once they earn that progression. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, we're going to practice a lot of this stuff in our upcoming lab.